Excellence is continuous. It can be complex or simple. Each day is an open challenge to achieve success and turn adversity into opportunity. At RGF Executive Search Japan, we make winning a daily objective by aligning unique bilingual talents who invigorate organizations and drive sustainable growth. Excellence begins and ends with people. To execute your Japan recruitment relationship, contact us and let's begin.
Good evening and welcome to the webinar with Arjuna from Illumina Japan on accelerating access to cancer diagnostics. My name is Ryan Shepard from RGF Executive Search Japan, and I'll be your host this evening. You might be wondering why an executive search firm is hosting an event on accelerating access to cancer diagnostics. And that's because in what we do, we are privileged to have conversations with decision makers in the industry, leaders of the industry. And this is a topic that involves everyone. It involves industry leaders to drive forward the change that's needed in order to improve access for patients to cancer diagnostics in Japan, which involves healthcare systems, the government systems, patient awareness themselves, as well as manufacturers at every step of the journey. But it also involves awareness, educating the general public about the disease, about the benefits of being able to diagnose cancer earlier, and being able to know what kind of questions to ask your doctor should you be diagnosed with cancer, so that you can have a sense of empowerment and hope, in your treatment journey. So the goal of today's webinar is to do exactly that, and Arjuna is going to take us through who Illumina is, as well as his own story and what Illumina is doing to accelerate access to cancer diagnostics in Japan as a very key player at the center of the genomics and diagnostics universe. So as usual, Q&A will be opened about 15 minutes into this event, and those questions will be picked up in the Q&A part, which will be after Arjuna finishes his presentation segment of the presentation. So I'd like to introduce Arjuna. Arjuna has a very international background and, like me, has a very deep family history in Japan as well. So although he's new to Japan in his professional career, Japan is very close to his heart. And I'd like to just hand it over to Arjuna to introduce more about himself, and so we can all get to know more about Arjuna. So Arjuna, I'm bringing you onto the screen. Thank you very much for being here today. And the screen is now yours.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Ryan, very much for the kind opportunity to speak on your webinar series. I feel really privileged to do that. And as you said, I'll try my best to introduce myself and what Illumina is doing in Japan. But yes, you're right. You know, my parents spent a long time in Japan in the 60s and 70s. So I feel like I'm carrying their legacy now since arriving in Japan last year. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and please let me know when that works on your end.
Yes, all good.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so again, my name is Arjuna Kumarasuriyar. I have the privilege of being the general manager of Illumina in Japan. And today there's a few things I'd like to cover and hopefully achieve. The first is, for many of you, listening live or listening to the recording, you may not have heard of Illumina. So I'd like to introduce us and a little bit about what we're doing to accelerate cancer testing in Japan. Most of my presentation today will talk a lot about the opportunity that we believe exists to improve cancer testing in Japan. So hopefully that's of use to many of you. I know there are several questions around that, so I'm hoping that addresses that. A key objective for me, not only because I'm relatively new in Japan, I started in this role in January last year. I want to connect with as many individuals as I can in the industry, essentially to invite you to join the quest that we're taking at Illumina to evolve the testing paradigm in Japan. As I'll share, it's not something we can achieve on our own. It's something that, as Ryan aptly summarized, it involves all aspects of the healthcare industry, from government, clinicians, testing companies like ourselves and technology providers, as well as the patients themselves. Now, full disclosure, I am not an oncologist, I'm not a clinician, and I'm not certainly a professional in the healthcare industry. And so those of you who are, it's particularly important that we hear from you. So insights from you, from whatever aspect of the industry you're from, are definitely appreciated. And that's because, as my final point highlights, discussions are what generate opportunities for change. So by engaging and creating opportunities for more of these types of conversations, we hope that we can continue to evolve the paradigm and ultimately achieve what we're all looking for, which is better healthcare standards. So before I talk about Illumina, a little bit about myself, given many of you may not know me. So I've actually been at Illumina a long time, about 16 years, in a variety of roles, from sales, marketing, channel management, and commercial operations. Most of those roles have had me operating around the Asia Pacific region, but I have lived in Singapore, Melbourne, Brisbane, and now Tokyo, managing everything from the Indian subcontinent to Southeast Asia, Korea, and Taiwan. And I have supported the APAC business, including Japan, for over 10 years. As I mentioned, I've had the privilege of being General Manager of Japan since January 2023. And my background is I have a PhD in biomedical sciences from University of Queensland. So Brisbane, Australia is my hometown. And I've had previous experience in tech transfer, quality assurance, and biotech regulation. And like I said, a key objective is to connect with all of you. So if you haven't already done so, an open invitation to connect with me on LinkedIn. My link is there, and I think it's on the webinar event as well. So Illumina's mission is to improve human health by unlocking the power of the genome. And the genome, as many of you will know, is essentially the entire complement of DNA that codes every living cell, including our own. And so, not surprisingly, because it is the foundation of life, the technology we operate in, which is essentially focused on interrogating and understanding genomics, has, as a consequence, application in a whole array of healthcare areas. Obviously, the focus of today's session is going to be on oncology, but just to highlight, we do operate extensively in areas such as genetic disease, reproductive health, infectious disease. Our technology, for example, was foundational and critical in the pandemic, in unraveling the new strains of the virus that kept emerging. And more, we are working with pharma and others around drug discovery and emerging technologies around proteomics. And that's just in the healthcare space. We also have extensive relationships in agriculture, direct-to-consumer genomics, and of course, researchers, studying fundamental basis of the building blocks of life as well in university communities. So we've been around about 25 years now, and actually 20 of those years we have been in Japan. So we have a long history in the Japanese market that we're really proud of. And as this diagram highlights, one of the things that we've really pushed hard on is innovation in technology. And that's allowed us to do a few things, but essentially it's allowed us to continue to democratize and make the power of our genomic technology even more accessible across the planet. And there's two main things I'd like to highlight that I think, we've started off primarily being a research company, but now we're moving more and more into the clinical space. And some of the advances we made in our presence in the research market have really created a great foundation for our clinical application. The first thing worth highlighting is the points under the title there. If you go back and look at the Human Genome Sequencing Project, which concluded at the early 2000s, depending on how you look at it, the entire project was just shy of $3 billion. Even if you look at the chemical cost, the reagent costs, it was in the few hundred million. What we've managed to do with our technology and many iterations of advanced technology evolution is reduce that cost of sequencing by almost 500,000-fold. And for those of you who are familiar with the semicon industry, there's a law called Moore's Law that dictates how rapidly technology can evolve. And that kind of curve is outstripping Moore's Law, something that we're really proud of. The second thing worth highlighting is there's around 25,000 Illumina instruments all over the world. And that means researchers, clinicians, anyone looking to apply the understanding of genomics to some sort of benefit to society. There's an instrument around the corner, and that allows us to partner and collaborate with many individuals across the planet to deliver solutions and life-saving technologies. If we shift gears and look a little bit more specifically now at oncology, it's not surprising that our technology has a huge application in oncology. As many of you know, cancer is fundamentally a disease of the genome. All cancers are caused by something going seriously wrong in the genome of a cancer cell. And so to kind of break it down a little bit and give you a picture of how our technology can really help, or how the sequencing technology we have can really help, I've kind of summarized it into these four main buckets. The first up is hereditary risk assessment, and what that is really helping people understand, what their predisposition to cancer is like. And the way I think about it is, we all start life with a deck of cards, right? There are certain genetic variants that we have that we get from our parents, and they set us on a path of being closer or further away from cancer. And the rest is essentially how we live our lives. Are we how we're exposed to environmental factors, what we eat, drink, how we exercise, exposure to the elements like the sun. That can all affect, obviously our chances of getting cancer. So a huge application of our technology is in hereditary risk assessment because of its comprehensive ability to look across the genome. When it comes to cancer itself, there are three main phases, and I think about it as like pre-cancer itself and post-cancer. And so the real advantage and a focus of what I'll be talking about today is around the first two of these, which is around detection of cancer at early stages. I think it's a common understanding that the earlier we detect cancer, the more treatment options we have to deal with that. So that's the first phase, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment. And the second major area of focus is therapy selection itself. Increasingly, the fight against cancer is becoming more and more molecular. It's becoming more and more targeted. And what genomic selection can help you do is essentially evaluate the options available and help choose the right drug, choose the right therapy strategy to maximize patient survival. And the final area, and this is somewhat of an emerging area, but one that's quite exciting in cancer care, is monitoring recurrence, or MRD, which stands for minimal residual disease. And this is essentially the use of genomics to, once we've gone through patient care and hopefully remove the cancer, is to now just monitor and make sure that the cancer doesn't come back. Obviously, relapse being an increasingly problematic issue with patients suffering from cancer. So despite this breadth of applications, it's perhaps somewhat surprising that, when you look at biomarker eligible cancer patients that actually receive genetic testing, it's only 1 in 3 around the world that get that. And that means that there's 2/3 of cancer patients are essentially missing a whole host of information that would really help with their therapy and fight against cancer. So, why is this information so important? Well, fundamentally, cancer is complex, and what we see here is, traditional genetic testing only looked at really 1 or 2 different types of genetic variation. Summarized here as SNVs, or single nucleotide variants, or point mutations, if you like. As we now know, cancer is incredibly more complex in terms of the aberrations that can occur in the genome. And these are kind of summarized here as things like insertions and deletions, variations in copy number, fusions, splice variants, and even more recently, this concept of genomic signatures, where literally the genetic profile can really tell us a lot about what's happening in that particular cancer, and therefore what therapy selection can be undertaken. Now, and using a variety of sources of information from DNA or RNA from the tissue, or even circulating tumor DNA, which is becoming more and more possible now, it's possible to scan these different variants all at once, and that's using a technique that we call comprehensive genomic profiling. And Illumina's technology is at the core of a lot of comprehensive genomic profiling tests. So what this figure here does is explain a little bit about how that works. So if you look at this, if you look at the first image, if you like, at the top there, this is kind of the traditional paradigm of what genetic testing in oncology looked like. It tended to be a single gene and a single type of variant being evaluated at a time. And obviously, that required a lot of guessing, a lot of experience on behalf of the oncologist to kind of pick the right test. And if there was a negative result, you would normally then have to reflex and go to the next thing. That can be expensive, time-consuming, and time is not something that obviously cancer patients often have a lot of. In more recent years, that's evolved into the next diagram, which is called small hotspot NGS panels, if you like. And this expanded on this idea of looking at more variants for more genes and more markers. However, it's still missing important alterations that could be occurring in the genome relevant to cancer. And that's where comprehensive genomic profiling comes in. The whole concept here is these large panels that for the first time make it cost effective to look at multiple biomarkers at once and look at variations of different types at the same time across all these different genes. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this kind of builds out in a little later in the presentation. So one of the major kind of facets and I guess evidence of where we need to really drive for improved healthcare is when you look in Japan right now, of the 1 million or so patients that suffer cancer each year, only 2% get access to comprehensive genomic profiling covered by the National Health Insurance. And so, one of the first things that, we are driving a strong agenda around and trying to partner with government agencies, obviously related to the regulatory approvals, other companies and stakeholders such as patients and clinicians, is looking at what we need to do to improve that testing rate. And if you look at how Japan compares to other countries, I think there's a strong case for more to be done. In this first figure, we're looking at how CGP testing, needs to be more available to more patients in Japan. In this table, on the left, we have the number of cancer cases that you have per year. And you can see Japan, as I mentioned, has just over 1 million. And in brackets there, that indicates the kind of per capita incidence rate, which, in Japan is about 0.8%. And you contrast that to somewhere like Korea, which has about 238,000 cancer cases, but that equates to about 0.5% of the population. However, where things really get different is the number of CGP tests administered per year. A country like Korea is doing 25,000, so there's a ratio of about 9 cancer cases per CGP test. And you contrast that to Japan, where it's less, it's about 22,000. It is going up year on year, which is great, but it's still at a ratio in the 40s to 1 compared to the 9 to 1 or 12 to 1 that we see in countries like Germany and Australia. So certainly there's a case here to say, to kind of other countries are deploying at a higher rate. And a little later, I'll share some case examples where countries like Australia are starting to see the patient benefits of that deployment of the test at that frequency. The other thing worth looking at is, the cancer deaths that happen in relation to the cancer diagnosis ratio. And in this case, a higher ratio is again undesirable. And I've got some more countries here that you can compare to as well. So unfortunately in Japan, 426,000 patients lose their life a year due to cancer, which roughly equates to about 42%, right, of a ratio of about 0.42, sorry, to the cancer cases. Obviously, a cancer journey is not the same length of period per patient. And so you can't kind of look at it in an annual basis, but we're using annual numbers for comparative purposes to help you see the differences. Again, you compare this to countries like South Korea, Australia, and USA, the number of deaths for the cases, the ratio is far lower. All of this is pointing to, there is a case for the diagnosis, or there's a correlation with diagnosis and deaths being reduced, and there's a correlation, obviously, with the improvement of the administration of CGP tests to cancer cases occurring. So I think there's a case really for CGP testing to be available, but not only just more available to more patients, but actually available a lot earlier. So if you think about, we've really simplified things here to look at the stages of cancer, but essentially, today, in most cases, stage 1 and 2 cancers, the preferred route and the most cost-effective route is to go to surgery. It usually takes care of things really well. Again, if you deploy the right monitoring processes afterwards, it can be quite an effective way of treating things. Stage 3 tends to be the same, particularly early stage 3, but when it comes to late stage 3 and late stage 4, what's happening now is you're starting to see the cancer metastasize. And as a result, you're getting regional or distant metastases occurring. And this is where you need either really harsh treatments like chemotherapy and radiotherapy, or as we're seeing increasingly more available, targeted therapy that are relevant to the actual mutations that have occurred in that particular cancer. And right now in Japan, the sad truth is CGP testing is reimbursed only as a last line. In other words, a patient has to undergo all other forms of treatment, such as chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and exhaust those before a reimbursement is provided for a CGP. Whereas in other countries, it tends to be first line, which means it's if you are late stage 3 or early stage 4, you get access to reimbursement immediately. And as you can see here, when you look at the stages of cancer incidence, like the good news is most cancers are stage 1 and 2, but there's a significant portion that are late stage 3 and in particular stage 4. And that's really, at the moment at least, the focus area for CGP where it can really make a difference. We expect that to continue to spread and improve options for stage 3 and even stage 1 and 2 with increasingly available therapies such as what's mentioned here, neoadjuvant related therapies or immuno-oncology therapies that are provided perioperatively to really supplement surgical procedures and increase their success rate. And again, that's where we will see CGP we will see a case for CGP to be more applicable at later stages. So hopefully you've seen some data now to kind of suggest that there's an opportunity. So what I'd like to do is to kind of say, well, let's fast forward into the future. Let's say we've all been successful in driving healthcare paradigms. What if we could imagine that we've changed that testing paradigm and more patients are getting access to these tests earlier in their journey? So before we imagine what we can do in Japan, let's look at what's happening in other countries. So this is a fantastic study that was recently published by the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in the US. And I'll try and take you through this data. What they're showing and what they're evaluating is the clinical actionability of cancer patients following the application of CGP to help with therapy selection. Now, there's a lot of data here, so I'll try and summarize this for you. Essentially, when you have the different levels or the different colors, they relate to different classes of drugs. Level 1, right at the bottom in green, is essentially an FDA approved, all the way to gray, which is level 4, which is more research data supporting a particular drug used in a therapy selection. And so what we can see here with the immediate therapeutic utility, and this is data that's only 5 years. So in only 5 years, since 2017, you can see things like a doubling of the therapeutic utility in level 1 to 3A. And that level 1 to 3A is the most clinically actionable. Even when you look at clinical trials and you add those drugs in clinical trials, level 3B and 4, the clinical utility increases from 47% up to 70%. And more importantly, if you look at the light brown, if you like, or the cream colored part of the graph, the fraction of patients that don't have a clinically actionable genomic alteration, that halves from 44 to 22%. So in a short 5-year period, centers like Memorial, like MSK, are already seeing some major changes in actionable druggable targets, again, through the deployment of a technology like CGP. And if we take it a step further and actually look at what that means in terms of survival, this is data now from Omico, which is an Australian conglomerate of pathology, research, and hospital labs. And what they see really simply here is that survival can double in about 40% of patients that receive a molecularly matched therapy. In other words, they do CGP or a similar technology, they get matched to a molecular drug target. 40% of those patients are getting a survival rate that's double. And that's what you see there. The orange curve of the survival chart there is those receiving tier 1 to 3 therapy that's been molecularly matched versus those that are unmatched. And I'll use this later on in some of the calculations that we're going to see, but you can really see that in other countries, we're already seeing a difference into how cancer can be managed and how survival and patient health can be really improved. So, okay, the first thing I'd like to kind of put a model on is what would it cost to advance a testing paradigm in Japan? And the reason I do this is one of the most common questions I get is, Japan has a nationalized healthcare system. It would be really expensive to deploy comprehensive genomic profiling tests like this to, the number of cancer patients we have supported by a nationalized healthcare system. And that's a fair enough, right? And Japan is very proud and rightly should be of its healthcare system being nationalized and available to everyone. And making sure that there's a responsible spend of budget is obviously a key consideration, and we understand that. So I've done a quick mock-up here and a model to kind of illustrate the opportunity that we have in front of us. So again, this is a hypothetical model and very much simplified numbers, and I'll talk about some of the considerations in a moment. But as I mentioned, there's about 1 million cases of cancer a year in Japan. If you look at the 18% of distant metastases, or about 180,000 patients, that equates to about 180,000 patients. So this is the target or the bare minimum that could benefit from CGP. As I mentioned earlier, it could be well above that based on upcoming therapies and options. CGP reimbursement right now is 560,000 yen per case. So if you maintain that, and again, I'll talk about reimbursement in a moment, that's about 100 billion yen. Now, that might sound like a lot, but to put it in perspective, that's less than 25% of what Japan spent just on PCR tests during COVID. Doesn't include rat tests, doesn't include vaccinations, and the whole host of other things. That sheer scale, obviously, of COVID testing was enormous, and we know that, but it helps put it in perspective what is actionable and it is possible in the cancer paradigm. So what are the considerations? Well, the model doesn't account for what we expect will be reduced costs and even reimbursement as the test scales. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, around just over 20,000 patients benefit from comprehensive genomic profiling per year in Japan. Increasing to 180,000 is obviously going 7 to 8 times above that. With that scale, there are economies of scale that we think can be realized. And so instead of being less than 25%, it'd actually be closer to 10 to 15% of the COVID PCR tests. It considers the distant metastases only and not the opportunity that's present in early stages, such as stage 3, as well as relapses of stage 2 and 3, which also, evidence is strongly supporting the use of CGP to manage those cases. Obviously, it accounts just for testing, right? We don't talk about the clinical and administration costs. That's not covered by reimbursement, nor does it account for education and training that is required to scale. And I'll talk a little bit about those issues because we recognize that those are real issues, and we want to be part of the solution, partnering with many of you and others in the industry on how we can drive that. But here's the benefit, right? Imagine we implemented that based on the data that I just shared you from the Omico study, as well as the Memorial Sloan Kettering study. Almost 50,000 patients in Japan or more could get a chance to double their survival probability with access to testing at this level this early in their journey. That's a huge impact that could be made just by changing the testing paradigm and the healthcare system that supports that. And perhaps to highlight that and even draw it even further, this is a newspaper article based on a publication that came out of New Zealand very, very recently in March this year. And it was interesting, the study basically evaluated survival rates in blocks over the decades. And what they've noticed is, if New Zealand cancer patients, if they were simply in Australia, in the Australian healthcare system, the New Zealand authorities believe that 1,000 fewer cancer deaths would have occurred in New Zealand just by those patients being in a different system with access to different diagnostics, different healthcare paradigms, and different approved drugs. And some of the takeaways here are huge, right? The challenges around getting the right diagnosis. Around 42% of New Zealand patients diagnosed with cancer are actually diagnosed out of the emergency room. So that's basically a cancer diagnosis coming out of an emergency situation, which is less than ideal and not proactive at all. And as you can see here, the other quotes indicate that the outcomes of a cancer isn't because the rates are high in New Zealand. In fact, they're actually very much the same or lower. Good outcomes are going to be a result of paradigm changes across the entire healthcare system, right, from diagnosis all the way to advanced care. And so the story we're sharing today is very much focused on cancer testing, but we're really aware that connecting with the other elements of the healthcare system to really deliver the patient benefits is obviously critical in that journey. So in the last little bit here, I want to kind of finish up by talking about what we're doing at Illumina to kind of push those boundaries of precision oncology in Japan. The first is currently there are about 5 CGP assays on the market available in Japan and reimbursed in Japan. All of them are powered by Illumina technology. We're actually bringing one of our own tests to the market as well to give even more choice for patients and clinicians based on our already approved NextSeq 550DX sequencing system. We're bringing the appropriate reagents and the clinical IVD report that have been submitted to the PMDA in Japan for approval, which we are looking forward to being able to share more news on that in the not too distant future. And this particular test, and as I said, the sheer volume of genes that can be looked at or biomarkers that can be looked at that are relevant to different cancers, it means that this is a test that's pan-cancer and pan-stage as well. And not only that, there's multiple markers. You can see hundreds of markers that are part of emerging, clinical trials, emerging research. So, an assay like this can continue to evolve as the druggable targets, increase in availability on the market, which means that there will continue to be options for patients and clinicians. The other thing we're doing is partnering as hard as we can, really, with anyone who's got drugs coming to the market that could benefit from things like companion diagnostics or a companion genetic test that can be included as part of what we evaluate in our oncology panel that I just introduced to you. So we already have some partnerships mentioned here. This is by no means the limit of the partnerships we have. We're also working with these partners in actual genomic discovery in a big consortia to help with drug discovery in the first place. So we're trying to apply genomics across the entire pharma value chain and continuum to help the options that are available for drug targets. Finally, and this is perhaps where I know a lot of questions are, what are we doing? And it really comes down to 3 pillars, or what I call our 3 partnership pillars. As I said at the start, we can't accelerate change on our own. And so our North Star at Illumina in Japan is to increase the awareness of and decrease barriers to patient access of genomics-enabled healthcare, or genomics testing in particular. So through that, we're having lots of discussions with the MHLW and their various agencies, educating and discussing what needs to happen to bring and evolve some of this testing into the clinical space. We're also seeking to set up alliances between testing companies to build a common voice for productive dialogue, and that's something we've just started the dialogue with Guardant Health, and we're looking to invite others to join us on that journey as well. We're also looking at proficiency, right? We're ensuring that our technology, as I mentioned, we're continuing to evolve our technology and bring our technology to market so that the best clinical genomic technology is available. And we're looking at training programs to address critical labor needs so that labs have the appropriately trained staff to take genomic testing to the clinic. And finally, like I mentioned, we're looking at partnerships for testing, CDX development, of course, access improvement that will benefit patients all over Japan. The final area is really the patients themselves. Even though we're a technology company and at best a testing company, we don't interface with the patient directly. We do think that education and awareness around genomics and how it can apply is critical. So we've done media training in the past to help them educate what cancer genomics is about so that they can report more favorably and more informatively to the public. We're constantly engaging in clinician education through a variety of channels where this is a relatively new area, but again, because we're not on that patient interface, but we are looking at how we can help with patient advocacy around oncology. And of course, anything we can do around public awareness, we are more than happy to do, including this webinar itself. So the last thing I'll share with you before I'd love to turn back to Ryan and get any kind of questions you guys have is recently on my LinkedIn profile, copied here as well, again, an example of what we're doing to really improve patient access to information and increase public awareness. I've put together personally a list of questions that through a variety of experts, I've kind of cobbled together and based off the work of previous colleagues, a set of questions that we think will be really enabling for patients to think about if they're facing a recent diagnosis and they're not sure what to ask their oncologist or seek further information about. And so I encourage you to comment on my LinkedIn feed on this, provide feedback, and more importantly, help disseminate this information, help make it more available. If one patient out there benefits from access to these questions to have a more informed discussion with their clinician, then this has been a success in my eyes. As I mentioned, every discussion we can encourage that really challenges the utility of genomics in oncology brings us closer to a better paradigm in healthcare. So with that, I really appreciate your attention. I thank you for your questions in advance, and I'll pass it over back to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Arjuna. Fantastic presentation. And I love how you've taken some very tangible evidence and numbers to really make the case for accelerating access to cancer diagnostics in Japan. Now, zooming out a little bit, of course, it takes time. We're in an extremely change-resistant country, not to mention an extremely complex industry. Interconnectivity between all the different players is vast. What would be your call to action, and to who? The different cohorts that are out there, whether that's pushing buttons in the government or how pharma and diagnostics can work together, manufacturing. What would be your call to action, and to which groups can really take away that message from this call today?
Yeah. First up, I think it's a really important question, and I agree. Change does take time. In fact, that's a great link to Simone's presentation from the last part of your series, where she talked a lot about change in Japan, and I think she had some great insights there. One of the things she shared is in Japan, change does take a good amount of evidence. They need to be really sure that we're going to make an impact. So I think that's the first call to action is. A lot of circles I talk into, and I will say this, right? It's not like we're fighting against a huge headwind here. Most people in most, whether it's the government, other healthcare professionals, and the industry, most people agree there's a huge opportunity. I think what we need to do is to now translate the agreement to what are the first set of actions we can take together towards that. And we don't necessarily need a revolution, right? We just need to evolve. So, for example, are there particular clinical evidence studies that are really required in Japan to help prove what other countries are seeing? Or what can we learn from what other countries are deploying and start piloting some of these programs in Japan to start seeing where the benefits are realized? And the other aspect is to think about, well, what would be a controlled way of deploying it, right? As it relates to education, costs, the actual infrastructure required, that's huge on a national level for all cancers all the time. But it can grow and it needs to grow. So again, it's a lot for me about my call to action to everyone is to trigger those conversations, right? Be the person in the conversations that says, what can we do now? How can we start? What would help us head in that direction? Change might be slow, but as long as we're moving in the right direction.
And I imagine time for those conversations is ripe. more than ever because oncologics are by far leading late-stage pipelines in Japan at both Japanese and the foreign affiliated pharmas in Japan. So how do you see, as access to diagnostics improves, and as these new drugs are launched in the next, on the horizon, how do you see this reaching its tipping point? Like, can you peg at all when that timing is, or what kind of environment is going to have to eventuate for that to occur?
Yeah, it's hard to predict the time, right? Because obviously a lot of it depends on how the drugs that are in development and how long they take to get approved, and obviously there's challenges there as the mechanisms of actions get increasingly more complex and are based on increasingly more complex biology, right? The way I think about it myself is, all the low-hanging fruit happened early, right? Where we had, blockbuster drugs that could address, key forms of cancer that had very, very typical kind of phenotypes. There was a kind of a one-to-one match and away you go. When you start talking about drug combinations, when you start talking about needing molecular signatures, it's incredibly more complex and a challenge for the regulatory bodies, and that's definitely something to be acknowledged. It's hard to say when that would be. I think within the next 5 to 10 years, I do think we should start to see some major changes in how cancer's treated. Something I've been made aware of is some of these oncology drugs out there. When people talk about I'm getting treatment for cancer, we all get images of chemotherapy, we get images of hair loss, we get images of exhaustion and fatigue. We're now seeing drugs or targeted drugs where it's a pill you take at home. There's no hair loss, there's no fatigue. It's a completely different paradigm. So I do think that there's going to be a real change where I think we're going to be treating cancer as a chronic disease, not a terminal illness. And that change is going to be transformative in how we look at cancer and also how we manage it, right? Because when you're thinking about a chronic disease, then it's all about early stage detection, manage the cancer, and monitor. And I think that's where, every individual's, journey with cancer is going to be focused on that early stage detection and post-cancer monitoring. That's going to be the key, I think, to how this kind of evolves. The rest in the middle is that matching of therapies with appropriate genomic signatures to help, make sure that it's administered to the right patient at the right time.
Okay. And I noticed that you have partnerships ongoing with about 10 pharma companies and about 29 IVD companies as well.
That's right.
I'm sure many of those are overseas, perhaps US or European,
Yep.
And generally IVD companies are smaller by size, which means that they've got to be more, hands-on and strategic in terms of market entry. I'm just curious as to your read on how those companies see Japan looking in on this market opportunity, calculating what's the right pathway, et cetera, but also just reading Japan from an outsider's perspective in terms of the regulatory and environment and how to get in. What's the kind of mindset that you observe there?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Because I think, and we've had these discussions with the PMDA ourselves, where the PMDA is really honest in acknowledging that the regulatory requirements in Japan are quite unique. And I know that they're doing a lot on their side to like open offices in places like Bangkok and Washington so that, companies can better understand the requirements in Japan. Realistically, though, it is a challenge, right? Because when you have unique requirements in Japan, and it's just one market, it's a challenge when you're fighting for resources to kind of focus on Japan when a lot of the times they'll focus on North American and European markets first. This is where I think, I think, though, that because of the incidence rate of Japan, because that, Japan has an increasingly aging population, that this problem will get worse. So I think most players recognize that. Honestly, and this is a big reason why we do this, if testing paradigms can change so that, for example, CGP becomes first line, that opens up the treatment options for drug companies a lot earlier in the cycle, right? Because then there's a pathway for them to administer a targeted therapy that right now if you think about it, the problem with last line testing is by the time you now test this poor patient who's been on a terrible odyssey, even if you pick up, right, and most of the, like I said, 70% of the time you are picking up a druggable, actionable target. Those patients are so advanced, they're not eligible for clinical trials. Or there may be other complications that are now happening with their health that precludes them from a particular targeted therapy. So, you know, the key is early and the key is comprehensive. So as that happens, I think Japan will be a much more attractive market from a drug company perspective because, like I said before, there is an actionable pathway to make a difference and actually address what's available.
Thanks, Arjuna. We have a question from a viewer from Parhat, and his question is, the molecular markers are changing and improving. How do these get updated on the reimbursement list in Japan? Is this also slower compared to other countries?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so it's kind of complex, right? Because what happens is the test itself, so the actual molecular test, right? The actual biochemistry that's happening in the test, you know, we're sequencing like the whole gene of the particular biomarker. So if someone picks up a new actionable variant that sits in an EGFR gene, for example, the chances are we're already testing for it. What then needs to change are a couple of things. One is either the indications, right? So if for example, it is a CDX, it gets listed as such on the product insert for the particular test. Or what is more common is in Japan, there's an expert panel that reviews the findings of the test and then recommends therapy outcomes. So what happens is most CGP testing providers have something called a supplementary report that provides the recommended actionable targets based on the results of the test. And that will indicate a lot of information about the drug and what it targets. And that information is considered by the expert panel. So in many ways, the testing paradigm itself is already built to take in the evolving biomarkers that become evident. Over time, will the biomarkers get, you know, will we find biomarkers that aren't on some of these panels? Yeah, absolutely. And that's where new panels will become available. When we first started, the panels maybe had only 100 or so genes. They're now getting up to 500 or more. The next stop from here, if you look kind of forward, is where things like whole exome or whole genome sequencing becomes kind of the ultimate test, where we've got the entire marker or entire biomarker set, as well as other genetic variants types, if you like. Epigenetics are looking at methylations, a new area of emerging interest in oncology, for example. So as those become available, I think the testing paradigm will need to adjust. That's expected. But you can already see the journey we've come on, you know, based on some of the figures I shared. We started with single test mutation, single gene tests, and now we're looking at all the variations across more than 500, 600 genes at one time. So I do expect this to evolve, but that's part of the evolution that I think we're on.
Thanks, Arjuna. Well, certainly Illumina is leading the frontier in terms of how these technologies can be applied in clinical versus research use where it traditionally has. Let's talk about the talent gap for a moment, because of course, this is something that it is global. It's not unique to Japan, but certainly the aging population in Japan, and Japan being a very domestic country with a low rate of job change, amplifies that talent gap. What's your read on the talent gap in Japan?
Yeah, great question. This is why we talked about education and proficiency, right? They're both part of that talent gap issue. So a couple of things, you know, I was talking to a clinician just last week who is a member of an expert panel at one of the universities, and they were sharing how it really is a challenge, right? When you think about clinicians who don't have a molecular education, right? These guys have not been trained on genetics and genomics. Increasingly, medical programs are, so some of our newer clinicians are getting that foundation in some countries and some institutions, but most aren't. And so a lot of the talent gap in this setting here is around educating clinicians on the molecular basis of oncology and how, you know, things aren't, you know, it's not surgery or a hammer like chemotherapy and radiotherapy. There's now so many more options, including immunotherapy and all these targeted drugs. So helping the clinicians to stay on top of this changing landscape is really, I think, a key area that the industry in general needs to work together to help. So I think that's one. I think one of the things that that this particular clinician shared is that, the supplementary information that's provided with the reports, continuing education programs that companies can run, they can really go a long way into addressing that. So that's on the clinician end of the spectrum. If you go the other way to the actual testing side, there are several labs where, the availability of people with the experience to analyze data, to run the appropriate tests is low. So what we're doing at Illumina, at least, to try and address that is a couple of things. One is as I mentioned, we're trying to start up training programs and partner with training institutions so that there's an availability of clinical lab technicians who have experience with next generation sequencing. And so when that addresses the talent gap, and as this test kind of democratizes across Japan, there's going to be an ability to address that. Secondly, we're trying to make analysis even easier. So we're trying to improve the reporting, which we've gone leaps and bounds. When I first started in this industry, you needed a code level bioinformatician with his little server behind him, plugging away to try and understand what's going on in the data. Now you can do it on your phone, right? You can plug into the cloud. You can kind of do analysis that way. So a lot of our clinical reports are halfway in between for regulatory requirements, but they are increasingly automated. They're increasingly simplified. And that will go a long way into reducing the amount of knowledge that the individual requires in order to make use of the test. Like we said, our focus is improving the technology so that the know-how doesn't go into running the test. The know-how goes in, analyzing what needs to happen now that we have a result and what that means in terms of healthcare.
Right. Okay. And of course, you need a lot of specialized talent to do that. As you grow and you're able to entertain candidates from adjacent industries or other industries, maybe you can just give us a glimpse into what working culture is like at Illumina and what kind of culture you're trying to build here, you are building here. What are the kind of values and characteristics why someone would want to join Illumina Japan?
Sure. So as I said, I've been here nearly just over 16 years. It's a dynamic place. It's pretty fast moving. One of the reasons I've stayed here so long is, frankly, the people. I get to work with some incredibly intelligent, incredibly passionate people. We take our vision and mission very seriously. A lot of us truly believe that genomics can fundamentally revolutionize how healthcare is discovered, delivered, and administered, right? So, we take that pretty seriously. We know that we have a huge legacy that we can create. And so the people here we have are incredibly passionate and hardworking as a result. And we're also incredibly collaborative as well, right? We try and find the best in each other to go as far as we can and push the boundaries of what we're doing for our customers and for the patients we're ultimately helping down the line. And we're incredibly passionate about collaborating externally as well, which is why, my call to action around partnerships is pretty serious. We know we can't do this on our own. We know we don't have the expertise in the clinical environment like many others do. So we want to bring our technology and we think it can be life-saving, but it can only be life-saving in the hands of others. So that's how we tend to operate.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Arjuna, for all your preparation in today's presentation. I'm sure it's really valuable for everyone, whether scientific or the general public as well. So, are there any last words or a message that you would like to convey to use this platform to amplify?
Yeah, thank you. Again, thank you, Ryan, for the kind opportunity to do this. I think there are two things I'll leave everyone with. The first is goes back to that statement I made earlier. Start a conversation, right? So be part of the conversation. Ask how you can help. Reach out to us if you have interest in this area. If you're interested in how we can work together, building on stakeholders, working and convincing the paradigm from policy all the way to delivery to the patients. we're keen to have a conversation. So please do reach out is the first question. And the second is around, the questions to ask the oncologist that I've posted, right? I think every single one of us has an opportunity to make a difference to someone suffering from cancer that can benefit from enlightenment into, what's available and what's possible. So the more that, we can share the message around the possibilities of genomics, the more we can ask questions and start those conversations and enlighten people in the public that, there's information they can seek out, the more that will force us all to know more. The more it will create a need for clinicians to understand genomics, the more it'll put pressure on government standards to apply, better education and look to push the paradigm. So for me, it's about conversations that really will drive change.
Thank you so much, Arjuna. If you're in Japan, reach out to Arjuna and connect here locally. And if you are not, if you are a global executive and you're thinking about entering Japan, perhaps you're earlier in your business phase and maybe not perhaps ready to make a direct entrance now. But join us for our next webinar on Thursday, May 16th with Robert Clare, co-founder and CEO of HeckBio. HeckBio is a local company that has a marketing authorization holder service, but they have a very unique business model where they partner with pharmaceutical, drug device combination, medical device, and diagnostics companies to find a very unique way of entering the market here. And Rob is very much a reimbursement and regulatory strategist, but has a team behind him that helps to create tailored strategies beyond that. So join us for accelerating market access to Japan next month. And again, Arjuna, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your preparation today, for sharing the knowledge that you have and starting the conversation that you have started just yesterday with the questions in Japanese. I'm sure it's going to make a difference out there, perhaps quietly, of course, because it's a very private matter for people. But thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you again soon and working with you.
Thank you again, Ryan, and thanks everyone for your time and attention.
All right, well, that concludes the webinar for this evening. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening ahead. Thanks, Arjuna.
Bye-bye.